My name is John Wilson. Welcome to Online Events. We are recording, broadcasting and distributing counselling events online. I'm here to tell you about one of those events. We broadcast an interview with Keith Tudor earlier this year, but we hit some quite significant technical problems quite quickly into the broadcast. So I'm going to set the scene for you and then we'll roll the video. So if I tell you first of all what we wanted to do, we wanted to have the camera on Keith and I would interview Keith and we would take comments from the chat room that the online audience had access to. But quickly we were down to one camera, so what you're going to see in the video is Keith on camera, me just behind the camera asking them questions, and another voice, Martin Clark, who was also in the room, but he was on the chat room too. So he is feeding us comments and responses from our online audience. And you'll also see Keith turning to his right because he's looking at the chat room and he's also picking up some of those online responses. So despite the difficulties, we had a really good experience where Keith was able to make some excellent responses about some of the significant issues in the counselling world right now. Keith was able to really bring to bear some of his vast experience as a therapist, as a trainer and as a theorist. I think you're really going to enjoy Keith's comments. So sit back, relax and we'll roll the video. You were really saying something about how as person-centred practitioners it might sound like we're the only people who are focusing on the person, and that's not true. Can you say some of that again?
Yes, yeah, for the benefit of people who couldn't hear me at the back of the room. I think I worry about any therapy that claims a certain territory as almost sort of as exclusive rights to that territory. So for instance, with CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy, it sounds as if its proponents are the only therapists who do cognitive or behavioural therapy, i.e. therapy that touches on different aspects of cognition and behaviour. And of course that's not true. Every therapy does that. And in a similar way, so just as I'm critical of that, I'm critical of person-centred people who claim to be the only people who centre on the person, when clearly most therapists and therapies would centre on the person in front of them and their relationships with the therapist and indeed other people in the world. So I think probably the time has come to sort of make a change in terms of for people, therapists, to define what they do more precisely rather than have a global term that is possibly no longer useful. And as we know from the history of the person-centred approach, it's changed its name several times, so I don't think we should be precious about that. But as I was saying during the technical hitches, then I think if we look at, that's if you like almost a political, social, historical point, if we look at what it means technically or sort of theoretically, then we can say, yes, it means X, Y, Z, it means, you know, going back to some of Roger's early papers and propositions and theories and so on. But I think we also need to update that in terms of, you know, contemporary society. So I'm interested in, if you like, reconditioning the conditions or reworking the fundamental principles of the approach so that it makes sense in the light of, you know, 50 years of research and ideas since then.
Yeah. So we got a question just popped up from Sam Smith. So what could we call what we do? Oh, here Rich has responded client-focused. Client-focused,
yeah. I mean, I think this gets us into the debate about you know exactly what Rich is raising. You know, are we focused on the client? Does that mean that we focus on different aspects or configurations of what's going on in the client, or are we person-centered in the sense of claiming the personness of the client and the personhood of the therapist and so on? These are debates that the approach we've been having within and beyond the approach for years. And in a sense, I think in relation to say Sam, what we do, I think I'd be interested to hear from Sam what he or she calls what they do. So it becomes more personal and particular to the therapist. so that I can say I do a sort of, you know, a Keith version of therapy, but not to sort of necessarily, you know, claim an association which is confused or problematic.
Yeah.
I think ultimately we do what we do quite personally as therapists.
Yes. And you were saying something earlier about the actual technical focus of person-centred counselling could be on those theories that Rogers developed in terms of a view of the individual actualising itself. Yeah,
I think that we all, the therapists, as indeed other professionals, actually work from a sort of personal philosophy, which in therapeutic terms I think works better if it fits with the philosophy of the approach that's espoused. So in other words, if somebody claiming to be a person-centred therapy didn't believe or didn't think better that the human organism tends to actualise, that would be a bit of an incongruence between their personal philosophy and the philosophy or principles of the approach. So what I'm interested to do in my work and in my training and supervising is to, in a sense, to try to help the practitioner or the client, but let's talk about the practitioner, really own and espouse their personal philosophy, and then to sort of match that against the principles of the approach and see whether there's what Mike Worrell and I refer to as a philosophical congruence or fit between the two. And so that's why I tend to go back to sort of philosophy and principles as underlying practice, and indeed why Mike and I called our book Person-Centred Therapy a Clinical Philosophy, because in effect we were saying that you are a philosopher in the clinic. You're working on the basis of certain principles, and it's better to know those principles, make those explicit, than to have them sort of implicit or unexamined.
Yeah. So you're saying something about the person-centred practitioner. It's to do with the practitioner's philosophy matching the person-centred approach.
Yes. Yeah. And maybe there are places where it doesn't match, or you get, you know, you feel pulled in different directions. I mean, to give you an example, so I was just distracted by an interesting line coming in there.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
What I've been doing, I just put a comment saying that I wasn't sure if John mentioned at the beginning that his concept, or a concept here, was to create a dialogue with the chat room.
Yeah.
So just to make sure that people are posting comments.
Great.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine. Interruptions are interesting. Yeah, I was just remembering a story actually about I'm interested as a therapist in working with interruptions, and the word has the same root as the word.